Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The bell has rung. I invite you to take your seats for the final session of today's conference, which is on Sportsmen, Women's Auxiliary and Prisoners of War. And I'll introduce the third but last speaker, Ian Wilkinson, while you take your seats. I've just met Ian Wilkinson today, and I didn't realise we have in our midst an historian of sport and education with a Melbourne focus. And his contribution to In the Fight deals with cricketers and other sportsmen in the Burma campaign. So, Ian, 10 minutes.
Thank you. My chapter looks at the lives of some Australian sportsmen, particularly cricketers who served in the Burma campaign. The life of Ross Gregory, the only Australian Test cricketer to die in the Second World War, is covered in some detail, while there are shorter profiles on three members of the RAAF cricket team that played 2 tests against the RAF in India in late 1944 and early 1945. In the second of these, the RAAF team was led by former Australian Test captain Victor Richardson. Later in 1945, after hostilities in the Pacific ended, Richardson provided assistance to the Australian Services 11 during their tour of India. The chapter concludes with a brief look at the lives of 3 footballers who had played at the elite level before the war and subsequently became involved in the Burma campaign. Before giving some more detail about the chapter, I should mention that I do not see it as exhaustive in terms of either its coverage of Australian sportsmen who served in the Burma campaign or the sporting activities that were organised for Australian servicemen in this theatre of the war. My main professional interest has been in the history of Australian education, particularly secondary education in Victoria in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm also interested in the history of Australian sport and have written previously on the development of school games in Victorian secondary boys' schools. Drawing on the English public school model, many secondary educators in Victoria and elsewhere believe that playing games not only produced fit young men, but also provided valuable lessons that help build character, develop teamwork and promote leadership skills. For these educators, school games became even more important during World War I because they believed participation in them provided good preparation for war service, which some even called the greater game. Although the horrors of World War I had probably convinced most Australians that war was not a game, the recruitment of talented sportsmen during World War II was still seen as advantageous to the war effort. Ross Gregory was educated at Melbourne's Wesley College. Lawrence Adamson, Wesley's headmaster from 1902 to 1932, was a firm believer in the value of school games. He was also involved in the administration of major amateur sporting bodies in Melbourne and believed that the ideal sportsman was an amateur because the moral lessons that sport provided were diminished when money became involved. During World War I, Adamson argued against continuing professional sporting competitions because they provided a monetary incentive for young men not to join the armed forces. Although Adamson died shortly after Gregory started at Wesley, he would have admired Gregory's sporting ability and decision to serve his country when World War II broke out. Gregory was a member of Wesley's undefeated first cricket teams in 1933 and 1934. In 1933 and 1934. At only 19, he was selected in the Victorian state team and the following season scored a century against the touring English team. Soon after, he was selected in the Australian team for the 4th test of the 1936-37 Ashes series. Gregory shared a century partnership with Australian captain Don Bradman in the second innings of this game. And there's a photo of them going out onto the Adelaide Oval during those partnership on the left-hand side at the top. He was retained for the 5th test, where he scored 80 runs in Australia's only innings, being caught by England's Hedley Verity off the bowling of Ken Farnes. Sadly, all 3 lost their lives in World War II. Somewhat controversially, Gregory was not selected in the Australian team to tour England in 1938. He continued to play for Victoria, but announced before the 1939-40 season that he was no longer available due to work and study commitments. He had recently become engaged, but he did not disclose that he had made himself available for military service shortly after war was declared. Gregory joined the RAAF and began training as a navigator in Australia. He was subsequently sent to the UK, where he flew sorties over France and Germany in Wellington bombers. He was posted to India in April 1942. Cricket historian David Frith published a biography of Gregory in 2003. This includes extracts from Gregory's diary, started 3 days before he left Australia. Frith provides a detailed analysis of the crash of Gregory's Wellington bomber in June 1942, which led to his death and that of 5 other crew members. The crash took place in what was then Indian Bengal and is now part of Bangladesh. There are a number of possible reasons for the clash, including bad weather. Investigations carried out on Frith's behalf in Bangladesh in the early 2000s, including interviews with local villagers who had seen the crash when they were children, suggest that there was more than one Wellington in the area at the time. This led Frith to speculate that Gregory's plane may have been hit accidentally by a bomb released by one of the other Wellingtons. While there's no evidence Gregory played organised cricket while in the RAAF, matches involving Australian servicemen were played in England during the war, and games were organised in other places where Australians were stationed. Amongst the games organised in India were 2 tests in New Delhi between teams representing the RAAF and RAF. Victor Richardson, who served as a welfare officer attached to the RAAF liaison office in New Delhi from early 1945, captained the RAAF in the second of these games. The Australian War Memorial Collection includes a number of photographs taken at this match. According to the description accompanying one of them, wide publicity was given to the game, and both days' play was broadcast by All India Radio. Many RAAF servicemen and former Australians domiciled in India watched the game. Unlike Richardson, the other RAAF team members were not former Australian or state representatives. Most, however, had played local cricket at a high standard. 3 team members were Vic Guthrie, Ken Elkhorn and Don Ross. Guthrie joined the RAAF when war was declared and left for England in 1942. He flew Spitfires and Hurricanes in the UK and was later posted to India, where he undertook operations in Burma, India and Ceylon. An accomplished cricketer, Guthrie scored 100 not out for the RAAF on the first day of the first test against the RAF. At war's end, Guthrie was sent to Japan, where he spent 2 years as part of the British Commonwealth Overseas Forces. He then served in various roles in Australia before taking command of the newly formed RAAF transport flight in Vietnam. He eventually settled in Canberra, joining the staff of Government House after discharge from the RAAF. He retired just before his 65th birthday and died in 2015, aged 92. Elkhorn did initial pilot training in Australia before completing more advanced training in the UK, flying Wellington and Liberator bombers. He was transferred to India in October 1943. Elkhorn had played club cricket in Perth and Adelaide before the war, and while in England participated in 2 matches for RAAF teams. In India, he played in both the RAAF tests. In 1944, Elkhorn piloted one of the RAF Liberators based in India that bombed Port Blair in the Andaman Islands. These islands were occupied by the Japanese during the war. As a result of these long-haul actions, Elkhorn was awarded the DFC. Elkhorn returned to Australia after the war, moved to Melbourne, where he died in 2005. Ross had been employed by the State Savings Bank of Victoria before joining the RAAF. He was sent to the UK, where he worked at the RAAF's overseas headquarters in London. After officer training, he served briefly in Egypt before arriving in India in March 1944. He was attached to the RAAF liaison office in New Delhi, working in pay and accounts. Ross, who had been a member of a Victorian Country 11 that played the touring Englishman in 1937, captained the RAAF team that took on the RAF at Lord's in London in 1942. In India, he top scored in the RAAF's first innings in the second RAAF Test. After the war, Ross became the state bank manager and then studied savings banking in North America. He was appointed the bank's assistant general manager in 1962 and was promoted to general manager in 1972. He later served as a commissioner of the bank for 7 years from 1977. Ross died in 2010, just before his 98th birthday. As was the case after World War I, cricket matches between teams representing Australia and England were organised soon after hostilities in World War II ended. In England, the Australian Combined Services 11 played 5 matches against England, the first commencing on the 19th of May 1945. These games have come to be known as the Victory Tests. The Australian Services 11 was captained by Lindsay Hassett, who had toured England with the 1938 Australian team. During the war, he had served in the with the AIF in the Middle East and New Guinea. In mid-1944, he joined the second AIF reception group in England, which was tasked with preparing for the repatriation of Australians who had been held prisoner in Europe. This group also included other talented cricketers. They were joined in the service of 11 by RAAF and other Australian personnel who were still stationed in the UK. The success of the Victory Test prompted Australian authorities to send the Services 11 to India and Ceylon on their way home. The team arrived in India in October 1945 and during their tour played 3 matches against Indian representative sides. As Australian cricket authorities had mostly ignored the subcontinent before this, the Australians had the opportunity to play against some of India's best cricketers for the first time. An Indian representative team later toured Australia during the 1947-48 summer season. Victor Richardson was not a member of the services team, but assisted them while they were in India. Although the tour proved arduous for the players, they were generally well looked after by their Indian hosts. After a game in Ceylon, the team returned to Australia, where they played matches against Australia's state teams. Cricketers were, of course, not the only Australian sportsmen to serve in the Burma campaign. For example, Ted Regan, who was a member of the Essendon team that was defeated in the 1941 Victorian Football League Grand Final, lost his life in Burma. Regan had joined the RAAF in 1941 and after basic training in Victoria, received further training in Rhodesia. He then went to India as a Blenheim bomber pilot. Regan died in July 1943 when the Blenheim he was co-piloting was shot down by the Japanese. It was part of a 6-aircraft raid on the Burmese town of Rauri. Pup Raymond, as mentioned by Andrew, Roland Raymond, studied medicine at the University of Sydney. He also made his name as a rugby union player, being selected in 13 international matches for the New South Wales Waratahs in the early 1920s. Raymond was a Rhodes Scholar and continued his medical studies at Oxford University. He gained specialist qualifications and returned to Australia in the late 1920s. He then joined the medical branch of the RAF and served in India and Burma. He was in charge of a casualty clearing station during the retreat from Burma by British forces in 1942. Raymond was later in charge of a surgical unit in North Africa before becoming Assistant Director of Medical Services to the 4th Indian Division in Italy and Greece. After the war, he returned to specialist practice in Sydney, where he died in 1964. Harley Stone studied arts and law at the University of Queensland. He was a member of the Combined Australian Universities rugby union team that toured Japan in 1934. Sturm was also a Rhodes Scholar, studying law at Oxford. In addition, he joined the University Air Squadron and learned to fly. Soon after returning to Brisbane to get married, he was ordered to RAF headquarters in Singapore. Following the fall of Singapore, he served in various parts of the Pacific, flying many raids against the Japanese. Eventually posted to India, he carried out operations over Burma. As a result, Sturm was awarded the DFC. He lost his life in a flying accident in May 1944. Finally, returning to Ross Gregory. He was like many young Australians who chose to join the fight in World War II. He was just starting adult life, he had chosen a career, and he was looking forward to marriage and possibly starting a family. Sadly, the war deprived him of a chance to develop further his extraordinary talent as a cricketer. How much fame he could have won on the cricket field will never be known.
Thank you, Ian. That's a very poignant story you tell.